I will call my dad. Those words drop into the middle of a first-grade classroom, freezing time completely. You and I are going to unpack this case file together. Starting right here in this room, pencils stop scratching. A child by the window forgets to breathe. The teacher, Emily Hayes, stands over little Sophia Moretti, hand extended, demanding the phone. Sophia clings to it like a psychological lifeline. Emily repeats her demand in a low-level tone, knowing instinctively that quiet repetition dominates a space faster than a scream. The lesson here is simple. Power does not need to shout to be felt. True authority rests in the quiet confidence of knowing you hold the cards. A trait we see mirrored perfectly in the predators I study. Let us examine the underlying pathology of this moment, because trauma always leaves a physical signature. Emily wears her sleeves pulled down despite the heat, concealing a fresh bruise shaped exactly like a human thumb beneath her turtleneck. Sophia looks up at her. These are not the eyes of a guilty 6-year-old child, they are the cold, calculating eyes of a survivor assessing a potential threat. Sophia explains her mother is dead, and she only wanted to read a text from her father. The admission strikes Emily with the blunt force of shared trauma, yet she maintains her boundary. It teaches us a vital life lesson. We never truly know the invisible battles people are fighting right beside us, so we must tread carefully. Emily enforces the institutional rules but offers a clinical compromise. She will hold the device, and Sophia may use the office landline. Sophia simply stares at her with the heavy, exhausted assessment of two adults negotiating a treacherous psychological contract on a child. This level of hypervigilance should look absurd, but on Sophia, it only reveals a devastating mental fatigue. She surrenders the phone, stating softly that her father will come. She does not throw a tantrum or make a threat. It is an absolute truth in her mind, highlighting a crucial life lesson. Trust is not built on empty promises, but on the undeniable consistency of our actions, even when those actions stem from a megalomaniac narcissist. It is the unshakable certainty of a subject who has been conditioned to view her caretaker as an omnipotent force. Emily secures the phone and redirects the class to mathematics. Time ticks forward, yet during silent reading, Emily observes Sophia tracking the second hand of the clock with the precision of a trained predator. Recognizing the escalating anxiety, Emily concedes. She writes a hall pass instructing the girl to use the office phone. Sophia accepts the paper with both hands, cradling it as if her survival depends on it. The lesson we can draw from this behavior is quite clear. To a person starved of control, the smallest concession of power feels like a monumental victory for their safety and peace of mind. Sophia navigates the bright hallway, passing colorful paper suns while gripping the hall pass like a psychological shield. What no one in that building comprehends is the dangerous synchronicity occurring miles away. At that precise second, a black Cadillac Escalade departs a secured Manhattan compound, accelerating violently across the Brooklyn Bridge. In the school office, the secretary flashes a grandmotherly smile, entirely oblivious to the predatory ecosystem surrounding this child. Sophia places the pass on the desk with calculated formality, announcing she has permission to call her father. The life lesson here is stark but true. Innocence is often just a fragile illusion, existing right alongside the darkest realities. The secretary slides the heavy receiver across her desk, blissfully ignorant of the apex predator waiting on the other end. Sophia inputs 10 digits entirely from memory, her fine motor skills unaffected by stress. A man answers after 2 rings. His voice registers at a dangerously low frequency, the hallmark of a megalomaniac who commands total obedience without raising his volume. In Manhattan, Nicholas Moretti sits flanked by 5 subordinates debating logistics. Upon seeing the school caller ID, he merely raises a single hand and the room falls into immediate terrifying silence. It offers us a profound life lesson. True influence is not measured by the noise you make, but by the silence you command when you move. The silence in that boardroom carries the crushing weight of impending violence. Sophia reports the confiscation of her phone, pleading her innocence. Nicholas instantly probes for any sign of punishment. When Sophia denies it, even defending Emily is kind. An agonizing 3 seconds of absolute dead air follows. You and I know exactly what is happening in his brain in those 3 seconds. His violent associates realize all operations are suspended. Nicholas orders his daughter to pass the phone to the secretary. The sweet woman answers with a cheerful greeting, entirely unprepared for the psychological dismantling about to occur. Our final lesson is this. The most dangerous moments in life are never loud. They are the quiet pauses before the strike. Let us observe the school secretary's face. It is a textbook study in primal threat recognition, over exactly 12 seconds. Her social smile disintegrates into shock, then sheer survival instinct, and finally, total terrified submission. She grips the edge of her desk merely to prevent a physiological collapse. She stammers an apology, hands the phone back to little Sophia as though holding an active explosive, and waits. On the other end, Nicholas issues a calm directive to his daughter to return to class and behave. The child complies without hesitation. She walks back to the classroom, where her teacher Emily is quietly attempting to help another student through a reading lesson. The predator is now in motion, and the prey is completely unaware. Sophia re-enters the room, offers a solemn nod, and takes her seat. Emily offers a reflexive, maternal smile, but as she moves, her sleeve shifts just a fraction. A sharp spike of pain in her wrist serves as a somatic anchor, reminding her that this pleasant teacher facade is purely a survival mechanism. Her mind immediately dissociates. Flashing back to the acute trauma of the previous night, she visualizes her brother-in-law, Frank, stumbling through the front door at 1 a.m. He reeks of alcohol and carries the volatile aggression of a man who just accrued $3,000 in underground gambling debt. We see here the classic etiology of a trauma victim, internalizing the chaos of her environment while trying to maintain an illusion of normalcy. You and I need to pause here and unpack the psychological cage Emily is trapped in a functional scenario. The victim simply contacts law enforcement, but Emily cannot make that call. Why? Because the very antagonist causing her nephew Tommy to rock in sensory overload holds legal guardianship. Her mother surrendered control to Frank before terminal illness removed her capacity to choose. Emily was 22, possessing 0 legal standing and 0 financial power. Now Tommy is 8 on the autism spectrum, and the state foster apparatus would psychologically destroy him. Emily is locked in a prolonged state of hypervigilance, silently hoarding every dollar to reach a $15,000 legal threshold. Sometimes, the deepest prisons are the ones built entirely out of love. She currently possesses $4,800 in a covert account. She checks the clock, completely oblivious that in exactly 18 minutes, her psychological baseline will be permanently fractured. The time is 1:47 in the afternoon. Then comes the knock at the door. It is a deliberate, measured sound, 3 heavy impacts. This is the auditory signature of an apex predator, a man who has never been forced to hurry. Emily sets down her marker and opens the door to find Principal David Wallace. He is attempting a polite smile, but his micro-expressions reveal absolute, paralyzing terror. Behind him stands a man over 6 feet tall in a pristine gray suit, bringing the clinical coldness of the underworld straight into a fragile sanctuary. Let us analyze this spatial intrusion. He steps into this brightly colored environment wearing a heavy black wool coat, completely detached from the social norms of the space. His eyes exhibit the flat, affectless stare common in clinical psychopathy. Visible on his wrist is a timepiece worth more than Emily's annual salary. Worn with casual indifference, he offers no reassuring smile. The entire room experiences a collective nervous system freeze. A child drops a pencil, the graphite snapping against the floor like a ballistic report. Then Sophia stands. She does not run to him with typical childhood attachment. She glides forward with an inherited, chilling composure. He places a massive hand on her head, a nonverbal declaration of absolute ownership from a megalomaniacal narcissist. "You okay, princess?" he asks. Sophia points directly at Emily, stating her teacher confiscated her phone. Observe the group dynamics. Every gaze in the room locks onto Emily. You can physically see the carotid pulse hammering in her neck, a pure physiological fear response. But watch how the architect of this tension operates. Nicholas Moretti turns to this traumatized educator and executes a slow, formal bow. It is a highly calculated manipulation tactic designed to disorient astonishingly. Emily does not submit. She maintains eye contact with his predatory gaze and delivers the clinical facts. The rule was broken, so the device was secured. She demonstrates a rigid adherence to boundaries, proving herself remarkably resilient under extreme psychological duress. You and I must examine this behavioral sequence closely. This man commands violence for a living, yet right now, he is applying that same interrogative pressure to a teacher, probing her narrative for any weakness. When she finishes, he simply nods. The sudden absence of threat is almost dizzying, then he pivots to his daughter. "Did you know the rule?" he asks. "Yes." Was the teacher right? A microscopic pause and the child concedes. "Yes, now." Observe the mechanism of a true megalomaniac. He demands the confiscated phone. He holds it in his hand, executing the ultimate demonstration of dominance. Then he returns it to the child. It was never about the device. It is entirely about proving who possesses supreme authority to grant permission. That is the essence of true power. Let us examine the subject, Moretti. Notice how he refrains from simply pocketing the phone. He dictates to his child that the teacher is the absolute authority. It is a textbook manipulation by a megalomaniacal narcissist, demanding total compliance while appearing benevolent. Then the principal interrupts, sweating profusely. Eager to announce this man funded the entire school infrastructure, Emily experiences an acute trauma freeze. She recognizes the Moretti surname. He is infamous for waterfront syndicates and federal probes that evaporate into thin air. The principal believes he is throwing her a lifeline. But he has effectively pushed her into the predator's enclosure. She nods, paralyzed, thanking a phantom for his money. The lesson is clear. The institutions built to protect us often unwittingly hand us over to the wolves. Watch this power dynamic invert completely. Moretti shakes his head with calculated gentleness, stating he is present solely as a father. The atmospheric pressure in the room plummets under the weight of that psychological dominance. Children suspend their breathing. He descends to his daughter's eye level, his cashmere coat brushing against the institutional linoleum. He asks if she ate, if she worked, and instructs her to remain until 3 o'clock. It is the fascinating dichotomy of the megalomaniacal narcissist. He orchestrates the criminal underworld, yet compulsively constructs an illusion of domestic normalcy. He touches her shoulder, thanks the petrified teacher, and departs. What we must understand here is profound. The most dangerous predators in our society often wear the most convincing masks of common decency. The door clicks shut, and the auditory void left behind is clinically deafening. A naive child in the back row finally whispers about the exorbitant wealth of Sophia's father. Sophia simply picks up her pencil, stating he is just her dad. She operates in a state of absolute psychological insulation, entirely unaware she is perched on an empire of blood money. Meanwhile, Emily is experiencing a severe sympathetic nervous system response, her hand trembling violently around a piece of chalk. Fast forward to 3 o'clock, the dismissal chaos dissipates, revealing Sophia waiting near the curb. A massive black transport vehicle idles. A silent enforcer in a dark suit opens the door. For this child, this extreme security protocol is merely a Tuesday ride home. True tragedy often lies in what a child accepts as completely normal. You and I must pause here to dissect this critical pivot. Sophia climbs into the armored vehicle and offers a perfectly polite wave. Moretti sits in the rear cabin. The tinted glass lowers precisely 2 inches. He registers Emily's face, logging her physiological markers of distress into his sociopathic vault. Emily remains anchored to the concrete, immobilized by sheer survival instinct as the vehicle departs. But inside that isolated cabin, the true catalyst ignites. After 6 blocks of calculated silence, Sophia casually reports that Miss Hayes wore long sleeves in the heat, noting a visible contusion on her wrist. The innocence of a child diagnosing domestic trauma to a man who engineers systemic violence is staggering. It reminds us that children observe everything, even when adults assume they are entirely blind to our pain. Moretti halts his illicit communications immediately. He studies his daughter through the rearview mirror, demanding verification. She confirms it, detailing how the teacher demonstrated a hyper-vigilant flinch when water spilled. Observe Moretti's emotional regulation here. He does not erupt. He exhibits the cold calculus of an apex predator, ordering a complete background file on Emily Hayes. The megalomaniacal narcissist has adopted a new project. Contrast this with Emily's dismal reality. She inhabits a decaying apartment saturated with the scent of neglect. Her young son traces geometric patterns on the floor. Locked within his own neurodivergent sanctuary, she exhausts her empathy shielding other people's children, only to return to utter psychological isolation. Our capacity to give often masks our own profound internal starvation. Unsurprisingly, Frank is absent, likely squandering their critical resources. Emily anticipates his toxic behavioral loops. With the accuracy of a seasoned forecaster, she prepares a rigid, sensory-safe meal for her son, desperately clinging to any semblance of routine control. Then comes the precipitating stressor. She audits her finances. $247 remain. Against a $1,200 deficit, she collapses into her hands, suffocating under the systemic mathematics of poverty. The perspective then shifts dramatically to the absolute zenith of grandiosity. The 42nd floor of a luxury syndicate tower. Manhattan glitters beneath him like a conquered territory. She is clinically drowning over pennies, while Moretti dictates reality from the sky. Wealth does not erase pathology, it merely elevates the stage. Let us examine the subject in his element. Moretti sits with premium liquor he merely uses as a prop. His subordinate delivers the intelligence file. They have fully mapped the 27-year-old educator's life, including a secondary profile on the abusive partner. The operative advises him to review the abuser's pathology first. You already sense the violent escalation brewing now. Transition to Monday at 7:15 in the morning. Emily navigates her environment completely oblivious to the environmental shift. A luxury surveillance vehicle occupies her perimeter. Her chronic exhaustion overrides her natural threat detection. By Wednesday, the asset swaps to a heavy transport vehicle. A behavioral cage is being constructed around her, and she is simply trying to survive the morning commute. Exhaustion is the ultimate anesthetic to impending danger. Now you and I get to observe her cognitive dissonance resolve into pure terror. The operative on Wednesday is physically imposing, but the critical trigger is behavioral. It is not the vehicular anomaly that activates her amygdala. It is their unnatural visual discipline. Predatory baseline behavior dictates that men will track a vulnerable target. These operatives, however, remain absolutely statuesque. She passes their perimeter, close enough to perceive their breathing, and they offer zero visual engagement. That clinical indifference shatters her denial. By the time she reaches her institutional sanctuary, she is exhibiting severe hypervigilance. Obsessively scanning the perimeter, she learns a brutal physiological truth. The most lethal threats in our environment are often the ones that refuse to acknowledge our existence. Throughout the day, Emily's stress hormones completely hijack her executive function. She compulsively monitors the street during every instructional block. She assumes her panic is concealed. But children are highly sensitive barometers to adult instability. Sophia approaches her post-dismissal, delivering a clinically fascinating observation. She calmly states her father taught her that individuals who monitor windows are anticipating violence. Analyze the pathology here. This 6-year-old child processes the world through the tactical lens of a syndicate boss, paralyzed. Emily questions the nature of her father's occupation. The child provides a sanitized, terrifyingly accurate definition. He constructs buildings and solves massive problems. Sometimes, the darkest truths are spoken through the absolute clarity of an innocent mind. It is a brilliantly accurate assessment of a megalomaniacal enforcer. He is a fixer of structural problems. Sophia then extracts a rudimentary illustration. It depicts the institutional architecture, accompanied by 2 figures. Emily initiates standard therapeutic inquiry. Assuming the figures represent the familial unit, Sophia corrects her. It is a manifestation of the teacher and the student, because Emily guards the threshold daily. This is the precise moment her psychological defenses rupture. Emily is currently hunted by organized syndicates, subjected to chronic domestic battery, and teetering on systemic collapse, yet, within this child's cognitive framework, she is an impenetrable guardian. We often become the shields for others while our own armor is completely disintegrating into dust. She provides a brief physical embrace, rationing the meager emotional bandwidth she possesses. The environment then shifts back to the primary trauma zone. Wednesday evening. The apartment is saturated with the ethanol fumes of Frank's addiction. He demands financial compliance. When she references the Friday deposit, his violent ideation activates. This is the textbook cycle of intimate partner battery. Emily bypasses cognitive thought entirely. Her physical form executes a deeply ingrained trauma response. He propels her into the drywall. Her neurodivergent child begins vocalizing distress from the adjacent room. She assumes the fetal position, protecting vital organs from the incoming trauma. The true horror of chronic abuse is how mundane the devastation becomes. You eventually stop waiting for a savior to breach the door. The abuser extracts her final $40 and exits the perimeter. Emily remains immobilized, waiting for her child's acute panic to subside into sheer exhaustion. She navigates to his room, administering the necessary psychological lie that their environment is secure. The child resorts to obsessive numerical repetition to self-soothe. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now you and I must analyze this pivotal psychological inversion. Emily observes the street. The syndicate vehicle remains anchored in the darkness. The operative inside is a lethal instrument, yet a profound cognitive shift occurs. The apex predators outside are not assigned to eliminate her. They are hunting the parasite within her walls. In a classic manifestation of trauma bonding, the silhouette of a contract killer suddenly becomes her ultimate symbol of safety. Let us pause and dissect her baseline anxiety. Picture Emily deliberately extending her institutional hours merely to delay her re-entry into Frank's volatile airspace. She navigates toward her vehicle, her nervous system already bracing for conflict. Suddenly, auditory stimuli, footsteps approach from the rear. Anyone familiar with trauma recognizes that severe physiological spike, the immediate flooding of adrenaline. Half a decade of battery has programmed her brain to interpret a simple scuff on concrete as an imminent lethal threat. She rotates, anticipating the aggressor. Instead, she finds a syndicate operative maintaining a 10-foot spatial boundary. His hands are elevated, palms exposed. Employing the precise calming posture used on severely abused animals, trauma permanently rewires the brain, making us recoil violently even when offered salvation. The courier speaks with a chilling, rehearsed politeness. He hands her a plain cream envelope from Mr. Mority, no wax seal, no overt branding. He murmurs that it is merely information, then vanishes into a dark sedan. Emily sits paralyzed in her car for 2 agonizing minutes, staring at the paper as if it were an explosive. The message is 6 dictatorial words. Coffee. Tomorrow 4:15, I will be outside. No name or number. A megalomaniac narcissist never feels the need to introduce himself. By Saturday afternoon. She stares into the cracked staff bathroom mirror, dissecting the psychological irony. The only time she is pursued, it is by the apex predator of the city. We often forget this simple truth: absolute power never begs for your attention. It simply waits for your compliance. She tells herself she is just at the school to finish a bulletin board. You and I know we all construct these little cognitive lies to survive. She wears a thick charcoal turtleneck, not to impress a syndicate boss, but to conceal the ugly bruise Frank left on her collarbone. At 4:12, she walks out. The black Escalade is idling. 3 heavy seconds tick by on the curb. She stands at the edge of the psychological abyss, and then she steps right in. Nicholas waits in the back seat, offering a coffee in complete silence. The heavy vehicle glides away into the traffic. The haunting life lesson here is rooted in trauma, when a victim is desperately starved for basic safety. Even the claustrophobic back seat of a criminal getaway car can trick the mind into feeling completely secure. Observe the framing of this encounter. The sun turns the Brooklyn trees to pure gold, a deceptive backdrop for a dark negotiation. Nicholas stares straight ahead, his face an emotionless mask, delivering his disclaimer: she is not in trouble, and she owes him nothing. So why is she riding with a predator? Because of his daughter. He details how Emily recognized a child's anxiety and treated it as a valid human crisis. Emily deflects, claiming she was simply doing her job. Nicholas counters with a chilling reality: most people do not care. The silence that follows teaches a vital lesson. A genuine act of basic empathy is so vanishingly rare in our society that it inadvertently purchased a criminal kingpin's absolute, terrifying protection. As the park rolls by, Emily finally confronts the burning psychological question: why are his cars stalking her apartment? Nicholas drops the manipulation and states they are securing her perimeter. Emily challenges him: immediately, predators do not grant free favors. This is where we hit the emotional fatal spot. Nicholas offers a small, exhausted smile, a microscopic fracture in his sociopathic armor. He recounts a teacher who kept him late when he was 8, hiding him in the library because his father was a violent drunk. The clinical takeaway here is profound. This ruthless crime boss is subconsciously regressing to a terrified little boy, trying to save the woman who mirrors his only childhood sanctuary. It is a powerful life lesson. Our unresolved childhood traumas almost always dictate our most unexpected acts of mercy. The Escalade slows to a crawl outside a quiet cafe. Nicholas locks onto her eyes and delivers a psychological blow. He demands nothing. He just needs her to know his men are not watching her. They are tracking the domestic monster hiding inside her home. Emily steps onto the pavement in a state of clinical shock. Notice the chilling behavioral detail. The coffee he handed her is the exact, perfect temperature. He meticulously controlled even that microscopic detail. Fast forward to Monday recess. Her phone vibrates with an unknown number, but her brain already recognizes the caller. She retreats to the old oak tree, isolating herself. The vital life lesson here: true, narcissistic power never screams for your attention. It whispers from an unsaved number and expects absolute, immediate compliance. Let us analyze this phone call together. Nicholas maintains a flat, detached tone as he recites Frank's debts. $84,000 scattered across card rooms and a Staten Island loan shark. Emily shuts her eyes. The true emotional shock is not that her abuser is a degenerate. It is that someone finally clinically validated her nightmare then. Nicholas probes the core trauma. Why avoid the authorities? The answer reveals a devastating systemic failure. It is all for her autistic brother, Tommy. Her mother named Frank as guardian before his violent pathology surfaced. The tragic life lesson here is undeniable. The very legal structures designed to protect the vulnerable often become the exact weapons that trap them in a cycle of inescapable, silent abuse. Emily clinically spells out the fragile architecture of Tommy's mind. He requires rigid routines, his specific room, his exact sheets. If Frank is incarcerated, Tommy enters the chaotic meat grinder of state foster care, which would psychologically destroy him. Why not fight for legal custody? Because salvation costs $15,000. Emily sacrificed 3 years to save a fraction of that, which Frank routinely steals. She is drowning in mere inches of water. Nicholas processes this systemic trap with dead silence, then casually offers to completely erase the abuser in 48 hours. The lesson here is brutally simple. While institutional justice takes agonizing years to build a functioning case, a predator's street justice is terrifyingly instantaneous. Emily instantly rejects the offer, displaying remarkable survival instincts. She understands a core psychological truth: a megalomaniac never hands out a favor without a devastating hidden cost. Nicholas's reaction is fascinating. His tone shifts, projecting genuine respect. He labels her intelligent. She clinically corrects him, stating she is merely surviving. Back in his penthouse, Nicholas surveys the Manhattan grid. His enforcer, Marco, begs for permission to eliminate Frank. Noting Emily is the only subject to ever reject their intervention, she demanded nothing. The profound life lesson here: a firm refusal to participate in a narcissist's game of manipulation is the exact psychological trigger that makes them obsessively determined to protect you. Let us examine the crime scene. Emily is organizing macaroni on Tommy's plate, maintaining his fragile routine. Suddenly, the door violently fractures inward. Frank stumbles in, radiating cheap alcohol and paranoid aggression. Notice Emily's conditioned trauma response. She immediately uses her body to shield Tommy, fully prepared to absorb the physical abuse. Frank screams delusional accusations, raising his hand to strike. Emily simply closes her eyes, clinically resigned to her victimhood. But the impact never arrives. Instead, the apartment door is entirely ripped from its frame. The grim life lesson here is unsettling sometimes. The only force capable of neutralizing a violent domestic abuser is the sudden, terrifying arrival of a vastly superior predator. Before Frank's fist can descend, 3 men in immaculate suits materialize. The kinetic speed is terrifying. The youngest enforcer violently twists Frank's wrist in midair, forcing him down without a single sound. Another operative smoothly isolates the abuser from Emily. Analyze the silver-haired older man. He draws no weapon. He does not elevate his vocal pitch. He clinically informs Frank that they require a brief conversation. Frank stammers, his artificial dominance evaporating into pathetic compliance. The older man politely classifies it as a meeting. The psychological truth here serves as a potent life lesson. True, absolute power never requires volume. Domestic bullies will always disintegrate the exact second they are forced to face genuine, calculated violence. Observe Frank's face in this moment. His eyes dart toward Emily, desperate to project blame onto his victim. But raw cowardice overrides his nervous system. With a slight cue, Frank abandons his residence in humiliated silence. Emily remains paralyzed. Her adrenaline tremors so severe, she must anchor her hands to her legs. Tommy cautiously emerges, gripping her cardigan. The silence following the extraction is deeply oppressive then. Sal Lombardi offers Emily a highly formalized bow. He identifies himself as the consigliere and calmly apologizes for the disruption. The life lesson here is a cruel, psychological paradox. A ruthless syndicate afforded this woman more basic human dignity in 5 clinical seconds than her own family provided in 5 agonizing years. We need to pause here, because you and I are witnessing the textbook genesis of Stockholm Syndrome. Emily just realized a syndicate covertly surveilled her for 11 days. An operative sat in a vehicle, clinically auditing her trauma. She collapses into a chair, paralyzed by cognitive dissonance. Her brain cannot decide whether to feel violated or desperately grateful that a megalomaniac cared enough to monitor her suffering. This is her profound psychological tragedy. The operative ensures her no one will be harmed, and you can practically track the fracture in her psyche, the terrifying life lesson. When a victim trades a chaotic domestic monster for an organized mafia predator, The broken mind will falsely convince itself it is finally safe. Notice the behavioral conditioning at play here. The enforcer delivers a micro-threat and departs, closing the door with the gentle precision of a caregiver. This incongruity induces immediate somatic terror. We then observe the subject, Frank, isolated in a sterile warehouse. His autonomic nervous system is in overdrive, perspiration flowing under the glaring light. Across the table sits Nicholas Moretti. We must categorize Nicholas not as a mere criminal, but as a classic megalomaniacal narcissist who requires absolute dominion, dressed with clinical precision. Nicholas quietly asks if Frank understands who he is speaking to. Frank's profound sweating in a freezing room is a primal fear response. He recognizes that his physical survival is irrelevant. His psychological destruction has already commenced. This interaction is a textbook demonstration of psychological dismantling. Nicholas slides a dossier across the table, forcing Frank to confront his gambling pathology. The documentation is exhaustive. Every illicit wager, every debt, $84,327. Frank's vocal cords constrict as he questions the origin of this intelligence. Nicholas responds with a flattened affect, stating simply that he owns the debt. Observe the immediate collapse of Frank's defensive mechanisms. Nicholas reveals a crimson stamp of acquisition on the final page. Physical violence is unnecessary for a megalomaniac of this caliber. Nicholas has commodified a human life, converting Frank's entire existence into a mere column on a financial ledger. Let us evaluate this clinical file together, you and I. We must appreciate the extremity of this narcissistic control. Nicholas did not merely acquire financial liabilities. He purchased the mortgage of the subject's residence. He bought the very architecture surrounding him. As Frank exhibits tremors of a shattered ego, Nicholas issues a non-negotiable directive. Complete cessation of contact with Emily and Tommy. No digital communication, no physical proximity. Violation triggers immediate annihilation. When Frank notes his insolvency, Nicholas confirms that is the methodology of his trap. Yet observe the resilience of the abusive psyche. Even when utterly neutralized, Frank still exhibits a pathological sense of ownership over the child. A true megalomaniac anticipates every variable. Nicholas maintains a rigid baseline, sliding forward a pre-filed guardianship petition. He has systematically cultivated 14 character witnesses, educational staff, medical personnel, and observers of the wife's terminal decline. A coordinated apparatus designed for complete destruction. The counsel was secured with a token retainer of $1 from Emily, formalizing the transfer. Frank's micro-expressions register absolute defeat, clinically speaking. It is a devastating reflection on institutional failure. It required an apex predator operating outside societal boundaries to achieve the protective intervention the state neglected. Nicholas issues the final protocol. Relinquish all rights, evacuate the premises, and cease to exist. Analyze this reflexive, desperate attempt at autonomy. Frank questions the consequences of non-compliance. Nicholas rises, fastening his garment with a psychopathic absence of motor agitation, and presents a binary outcome. Frank is removed regardless. The secondary variable is simply the degree of orthopedic trauma inflicted by creditors. We witness the exact moment of behavioral extinction. The cervical spine bows, the musculature goes flaccid. Frank grasps the instrument and legally neutralizes himself. Hours later, the subject enters his domicile in absolute silence, flanked by 3 enforcers in the corridor. He avoids ocular contact with Emily. Unable to process his sudden loss of dominance, he retrieves a single bag from the primary bedroom and initiates a permanent withdrawal. 20 minutes to rewire an environment of chronic abuse. Observe the threshold interaction. Frank pauses, his hand engaging the frame. He rotates slightly, attempting to exert one final verbal aggression, a desperate bid to maintain psychological control. The enforcer delivers a monosyllabic negative, whispered with lethal intent. The abuser is neutralized. The lock engages. Emily remains paralyzed in the center of the room. Chronic trauma has fundamentally altered her amygdala. She is neurologically preparing for a secondary breach, yet the disruption comes from an unexpected acoustic source, her brother, Tommy. Overcoming 24 months of severe isolation, the child initiates physical contact. He questions if the malevolent figure has departed. A profound clinical breakthrough. She verbally validates the cessation of their shared trauma, a crucial step in nervous system regulation. The perspective then shifts to the architect of this intervention. Nicholas crosses into his unlit residence, an environment characterized by severe sensory deprivation. He locates his offspring, Sophia engaged with literature. He attempts to enforce a normative parental boundary regarding sleep, but the child bypasses the directive. She demands confirmation of her educator's security. Nicholas issues a definitive guarantee of Emily's safety. The child absorbs this data, then introduces a highly destabilizing variable. She inquires if her deceased maternal figure would have approved of Miss Hayes. The physiological impact on Nicholas is immediate. We observe a sudden respiratory arrest. The narrative provides critical etiological context. 36 months prior, a hostile intercept by an opposing syndicate initiates ballistic trauma intended for Nicholas. However, a temporal miscalculation of 240 seconds altered his psyche. His spouse exsanguinated on the pavement, maintaining physical contact with their child. When Nicholas observes Sophia now, he is not merely parenting. He is managing untreated post-traumatic stress. He validates the child's query, stating her mother possessed an innate capacity to identify pro-social traits. The child's anxiety decreases, allowing unconsciousness. Nicholas, however, retreats to his isolated study. He self-medicates with a high-proof depressant and engages in hypervigilant observation of the perimeter. You and I must analyze this pivotal psychological shift. He fixates on a framed visual stimulus of Isabella. For 3 years, this subject's survival was entirely fueled by pathological bereavement and retributive violence. But tonight, a minor cognitive restructuring occurs. Concurrently, Emily is battling severe trauma-induced hypervigilance. The primary aggressor is removed, but her somatic memory remains active. She engages redundant security hardware. She maintains maximum illumination in the cooking area. She consumes nutrients from a standing position, her auditory cortex scanning for a non-existent threat. It requires 96 hours of absolute environmental safety before a behavioral lapse occurs. She abandons a drinking vessel on the central table, unshattered, unpunished. The condensation ring on that surface represents a profound cessation of domestic terror. No projectiles were launched. No intoxicated hostility materialized. She remained stationary, cognitively processing her newly acquired autonomy. The empirical evidence of recovery manifests in the younger sibling. The child resumes dining in a communal space, a behavior suppressed since his 6th year. His meticulous arrangement of utensils indicates a decreasing need for spatial control. Emily employs somatic grounding techniques to prevent an emotional breakdown during the meal. This sudden absence of cortisol cascades into her occupational sphere. An older colleague notes a visible reduction in physiological exhaustion. In response, Emily exhibits a spontaneous, uninhibited vocalization of pure joy. An extraordinary diagnostic observation occurs in the recreation area. Sophia approaches the perimeter, bluntly articulating that Emily's facial expressions have improved. Emily attempts evasion, but the child notes a shift from artificial contractions of the mouth to genuine ocular activation. Subjects exposed to early trauma develop hyperacute threat detection. They analyze micro-expressions flawlessly. Emily is struck by temporary aphasia. 72 hours later, a digital communication arrives. The architect of her freedom proposes a social interaction in a civilian environment. She exhibits a 3-second latency before consenting. They convene in an obscured Brooklyn establishment. Nicholas waits within, projecting the latent kinetic tension of unexploded ordnance. Observe the spatial dynamics of this rendezvous. A perimeter of armed associates secures the exterior, ensuring total environmental control. Internally, 2 deeply traumatized individuals simulate neurotypical courtship behavior. They exchange trivial data, suppressing the violent catalyst of their association. However, the narcissist struggles with deception. He confesses an aversion to public venues due to tactical vulnerability. Emily confronts this, subtly acknowledging her awareness of his illicit pathology. Nicholas exhibits no autonomic distress. He validates her assessment, yet introduces a desire for behavioral modification. He then forces vocalization of his primary trauma. His spouse was assassinated 36 months prior. The psychological loop closes entirely. Let us pause here. You and I observe Nicholas. He is experiencing profound cognitive dissonance, internalizing total culpability for a 4-minute delay. The most corrosive element of criminal pathology is the guilt that devours the ego. He has diagnosed himself as a monster, but observe Emily's response. This is the genesis of trauma bonding, a precursor to Stockholm Syndrome. She initiates physical contact, one brief somatic connection validating his efficacy as a parent. He accepts the touch. Why? Because even the most rigid narcissistic armor fractures under unexpected positive reinforcement. Here is the clinical truth of our condition. We construct our own psychological prisons, but occasionally, an outsider holds the key to prove the structure is merely an illusion. Let us open the file on Vanessa Blackwood. She is isolated in a sterile white leather penthouse, a classic gilded cage. She receives a photograph. In it, her megalomaniac partner, Nicholas, looks at a plain teacher with a gaze he has never once offered Vanessa. Her reaction is textbook narcissistic injury. The facade shatters. She violently hurls her phone against the plaster wall. In my line of work, we see this constantly. You can surround a patient with imported marble and unlimited credit, but it cannot synthesize genuine attachment. She immediately initiates a frantic background check on her rival. The clinical takeaway is quite simple. We often chase superficial status as a substitute for intimacy, but true psychological anchors are only formed in quiet, unpolished moments. Examine Vanessa's behavioral playbook. For 8 months, she exhibited strict compliance with Nicholas's parameters. No overnight stays. No integration with his child. She bartered her self-worth for unlimited capital, operating under the delusion that compliance would upgrade her status. The psychological tragedy is profound. All her calculated suppression yielded nothing. Her apex predator is currently in a mundane cafe, totally transfixed by a young, unadorned educator. It is a devastating reality of human conditioning. You can follow every rule in a rigged game and still lose your sanity. Life never rewards you for shrinking your identity to fit a narcissist's terms. It simply leaves you hollow in a beautifully decorated room. In a state of pure panic, Vanessa completely decompensates and violates the primary directive. She infiltrates his residence on a Sunday, attempting a forced maternal bonding session with his daughter. She presents a highly curated, falsely empathetic persona. But you and I know that prepubescent subjects are extraordinary lie detectors. Sophia assesses Vanessa's rigid facial tension and immediately identifies the emotional dissonance. There is no tantrum. The child simply grasps her father's hand and initiates a physical withdrawal, silently neutralizing the intruder. The psychological lesson is sharp. You cannot manufacture authenticity, especially in the presence of a child. The human brain is hardwired to detect predatory intent, regardless of how elegantly it is disguised. Vanessa attempts a compensatory maneuver with a synthetic smile, but Sophia remains unresponsive. Nicholas instructs her to leave. Observe the pathology in motion here. As Vanessa retreats into the corridor, her mask slips. She projects unfiltered malice into the empty space. Sophia misses this behavioral leak, but Marco, the syndicate's hyper-vigilant enforcer, catalogs the hostility immediately. He registers her facial contortion the way a combat veteran maps hostile terrain. Vanessa believes she is operating covertly, but she just identified herself as a terminal threat. The unconscious mind always betrays us. Your true character inevitably bleeds through the cracks when you assume you are unobserved, exposing your darkest impulses to the people who will neutralize you. We observe an escalation a week later. Vanessa's proxy agent infiltrates the school's parent committee, armed with baked goods and calculated smiles. She begins a systematic character assassination, seeding rumors about the naive teacher entering black syndicate vehicles. Emily is soon isolated in the faculty lounge, absorbing the devastating social contagion. Clinically speaking, it is a fascinating regression. A highly resourced associate of a criminal empire is utilizing juvenile relational aggression to dismantle an innocent educator's psychological stability. The brutal reality we must accept is that damaged individuals instinctively inflict damage. When a narcissist perceives a collapse of their power structure, their immediate coping mechanism is to drag the perceived threat down. Document Emily's remarkable ego strength here. Sitting in her vehicle, she executes a rigid boundary setting. She contacts Nicholas, states that his daughter cannot be subjected to collateral psychological damage, and severs the connection. She terminates a dialogue with a megalomaniac to shield a child. Nicholas experiences profound cognitive dissonance. The rejection instantly triggers his violent protective instincts. He deploys his enforcers to neutralize the hostile proxy. Note the divergent coping mechanisms. The empath protects her attachments by creating distance. The antisocial kingpin protects his by eradicating the threat. Authentic care is not defined by possessive clinging, sometimes. The ultimate demonstration of affection is possessing the cognitive fortitude to simply walk away. Marco extracts a confession within 2 hours. Nicholas summons Vanessa. She enters his domain exhibiting synthetic confidence, utilizing designer clothing as psychological armor. She attempts plausible deniability. But Nicholas systematically dismantles her reality. He presents a comprehensive dossier of digital forensics and surveillance data, entirely obliterating her delusional superiority. She miscalculated the threat matrix. Forgetting her adversary controls a lethal intelligence network, she regresses, stammering that she merely sought the truth. The bitter reality of human behavior is that deep-seated insecurity drastically impairs our executive function. We orchestrate our own destruction by attempting to manipulate pathological systems that we never actually had the capacity to control. Nicholas exhibits zero effective empathy. He clinically allocates her exactly 2 hours to evacuate her existence. She displays frantic attachment behaviors, begging for stabilization, but his sociopathic detachment is absolute now. Observe the classic narcissistic rage response. Instead of processing the rejection and retreating, her wounded ego demands annihilation. While descending in the elevator, she escalates from social sabotage to homicidal ideation, authorizing a kinetic strike. We pivot to Emily. Driving home, pressing a brake pedal that offers absolutely no mechanical resistance. It is a terrifying psychological principle. When you systematically strip away an insecure individual's fabricated power, their resulting desperation will rapidly mutate into something utterly monstrous. The vehicle loses all deceleration capability. Emily's car careens blindly through an intersection, avoiding a fatal collision by inches before she engages the emergency brake. She sits in the cabin, locked in a state of profound nervous system shock, hyperventilating. Before her brain can process the trauma, an armored vehicle blocks her in. The syndicate is already on site. One operative monitors her vital signs while another inspects the undercarriage. They anticipated the violent escalation before she perceived it. It is a severely disorienting cognitive paradox. The sheer terror of realizing your biological fragility is suddenly offset by the chilling security of a criminal vanguard. Our most profound safety often emerges from the darkest pathologies. The operative extracts a severed polymer line from the wreckage. This was a surgical mutilation designed to induce a delayed, fatal accident. The premeditation is staggering. Back in the headquarters, Marco is already displaying the visual evidence. A contracted saboteur compromising Emily's vehicle at the school. The displaced mistress has officially crossed the threshold into premeditated murder. Analyze the sheer psychological freefall here. A jealous romantic partner morphing into a sociopathic orchestrator of vehicular homicide in under a week. Clinical observation warns us about this specific trajectory constantly. Resentment is a highly corrosive cognitive poison. If left unmanaged, it permanently rewires the human brain for lethal violence. The megalomaniac experiences a total loss of emotional regulation. Nicholas strikes the table, mandating the immediate extraction of Emily and his offspring. Shortly after, Emily is escorted into a fortified penthouse. Observe the behavioral shift here. The apex predator crosses the room and voluntarily dismantles his psychological defenses. He stands before the traumatized educator and admits absolute culpability for her near execution. The systemic irony is devastating. He constructed a massive, violent infrastructure to insulate his attachments, yet his mere proximity is the very catalyst for their destruction. It is a grim diagnostic reality. Sometimes the heavy psychological barriers we construct to block external threats simply trap the monsters inside with us. He processes his guilt aloud. Before the trauma can calcify, Sophia rushes the perimeter and initiates a desperate embrace. Emily bypasses all rational threat assessment and kisses the child, solidifying a profound Stockholm-style trauma bond simultaneously. Emily's brother, Tommy, is carried in by a colossal cartel enforcer. That evening they are secured in a luxurious isolation suite. Someone has placed a single building block on Tommy's pillow. As an analyst, that data point is staggering. A syndicate of lethal operators regulating the environment for an autistic child. It disrupts our models of pure psychopathy. Even within the most depraved profiles, the capacity for sudden gentleness can emerge. Let us open this file, you and I, and examine the pathology of a late-night balcony in Manhattan. Emily looks out at the city. Confessing that her previous abuser was a terror, she could at least comprehend now. She faces formless adversaries. Nicholas stands beside her, his silence masking the megalomaniacal narcissism of a kingpin. He vows no harm will reach her. Exhibiting the grandiose delusion that he can control life and death, he does not offer a plan. Only the terrifying promise of total annihilation for his enemies. It is a profound psychological pivot. Sometimes escaping a devastating environment means unwittingly stepping into a far more lethal one. But the human mind is fragile. and when you find someone willing to scorch the earth just to keep you safe. The primal need for security makes that dangerous leap feel entirely worth it. Nicholas relocates them to a fortified Brooklyn safe house on the 18th floor, biometric security, an armed sentry downstairs. A highly structured, hyper-vigilant environment, but observe little Tommy, for a child with profound trauma. This controlled perimeter is therapeutic. At first, Tommy exhibits classic dissociative withdrawal, operating like a ghost yet. The catalyst for his return is not the crime boss but little Sophia. She arrives regularly, establishing a baseline of absolute predictability. No demands for eye contact, no forced verbalization, just a shared silent space. And here is a simple truth. True healing rarely begins with intense therapy or breakthrough conversations. It usually starts with the quiet, undemanding gift of a perfectly safe presence. Watch this fascinating developmental milestone unfold. Sophia sits on the rug, constructing her blocks parallel to his, maintaining a non-intrusive proximity. One afternoon, she places a children's novel on his desk. Tommy responds with an obsessive-compulsive alignment, edging the book perfectly to regain control over his chaotic internal world. By dawn, he has processed 2 entire pages, a monumental cognitive victory for a fractured mind. Meanwhile, the megalomaniac himself, Nicholas, arrives unannounced with heavy Italian food. The man who ruthlessly dictates the criminal underworld sits quietly over espresso. Utterly mesmerized by these children playing checkers, it teaches us a vital lesson. Even the most hardened, aggressive minds possess a hidden, desperate hunger for the simple peace of an ordinary, domestic afternoon. Let us examine the anatomy of this late-night disclosure. The environment is quiet. Emily asks Nicholas about his late wife, and he describes grief as an ache that simply integrates into the psyche. Then, Emily reveals her own deep-rooted trauma. She confesses a paralyzing fear of men, instilled by a sadistic ex-partner. She still exhibits severe hyperarousal, physically flinching at the acoustic trigger of a slamming door. She fears any new man will inevitably become violent. In response, this apex predator of the underworld does not offer empty verbal platitudes. He merely rests his massive hand over hers. The lesson here is profound. Severe trauma lives deep inside the nervous system long after the physical danger ends, and rewriting those instinctive reactions requires a tremendous amount of quiet patience. He creates a physical anchor, whispering that he too is relearning how to live now. Shift the observation to a sunny Saturday at Prospect Park. They are eating pizza on the grass, watching Tommy run, while Sophia expresses uninhibited joy. It is a meticulously constructed suburban illusion. A passing woman unknowingly validates this psychological projection, calling them a beautiful family. Emily experiences a severe autonomic nervous response, blushing intensely, but Nicholas, the megalomaniac, does not correct the cognitive error. He embraces the false reality completely, telling Emily he stayed quiet because he deeply wanted it to be true. The realization is staggering. We often construct desperate fantasies to hide from the grim realities of our own making, completely forgetting that such beautiful illusions are always incredibly fragile. Emily exhibits a classic trauma bond response, quietly agreeing that she wanted the illusion too. It is a shared psychological pact to ignore the surrounding danger. But just as the baseline settles, we abruptly shift to a Miami hotel. Vanessa, the discarded mistress, is using heavy alcohol consumption as a maladaptive coping mechanism. Her 30-day eviction notice is ticking down, exacerbating her decompensation. Suddenly, the phone rings. A nameless Russian man is waiting in the lobby. You and I know exactly what this means in the context of criminal behavioral patterns. The dread that fills the room is palpable. Vanessa practically drops her glass. The lesson is brutally clear. The unresolved toxicity of our past is never truly erased. It simply waits quietly in the shadows until the exact moment our defenses are lowered. Viktor Koslov enters the suite, presenting the ultimate profile of antisocial personality disorder. Platinum hair, a jagged facial scar, radiating pure predatory menace. This is an individual devoid of effective empathy. He immediately targets Vanessa's emotional injury, stating they share a mutual enemy. For the first time, her depressive effect lifts into a smile. Victor demands the daily routines of Emily and the children to orchestrate his psychological warfare. Vanessa experiences severe cognitive dissonance, fiercely demanding the child remain unharmed while actively enabling a known killer. Victor delivers a flat, psychopathic smile and agrees. Here is a haunting truth about human nature. Desperation makes us remarkably willing to believe the hollowest promises, willfully blinding us to the inevitable, violent consequences of our actions. Observe the clinical precision of Victor's manipulation. He employs a classic coercion tactic, feeding Vanessa a highly toxic psychological narcotic. He convinces her that once Emily is removed, Nicholas will revert to his previous attachment and return to her. Blinded by her profound fear of rejection, Vanessa completely ignores her survival instincts. She begins documenting classified operational security details, writing down safe house coordinates and daily transit routines. She physically hands over this catastrophic intelligence, without Victor even offering a basic social pleasantry. He secures the paper and exits, leaving her in an illusion of triumph. The takeaway is chilling. Beware of those who arrive in your darkest moments, offering exactly what you want to hear, for they are almost always the architects building your trap. For 10 consecutive days, the subjects experience a statistical anomaly absolute peace. The judicial system grants Emily legal guardianship of Tommy, the judge unconsciously avoiding the dangerous variables in the file. Emily relocates the children to a modest Brooklyn apartment. When the crime boss offers to absorb her financial burdens, she asserts her psychological autonomy and refuses. She even humanizes him, referring to him simply as Nick. This is the stabilization phase of their dynamic. He respects her boundary, a rare restraint for a control-oriented personality. Later they dine in a secluded Italian restaurant. Mirroring the behavioral patterns of an ordinary couple, it highlights a critical concept. True independence cannot be purchased. It must be firmly claimed, even when relying on a powerful protector seems infinitely easier. Let us examine this sequence together, because it represents the emotional apex before the psychological collapse. Walking down a brownstone street, Emily finally verbalizes her internal conflict. She admits her paralyzing fear of his violent world, doubting her emotional endurance. Nicholas responds with a grandiose narcissistic pledge. He offers to dismantle his entire criminal empire for her. But cognitive reality quickly interrupts this fantasy. He admits that a deeply entrenched syndicate cannot simply be deactivated overnight. It requires meticulous deconstruction. Emily responds with a smile of profound, melancholic acceptance. The ultimate lesson here is inescapable. We cannot simply walk away from the destruction we have orchestrated. Our past choices build the very walls that confine our future, no matter how desperately we want to escape. She quietly negotiates for more time, and he responds with a solemn kiss to her forehead. It is a striking behavioral shift for a man who previously operated without emotional vulnerability. But external variables do not care about internal growth. At that exact chronological marker, inside a decaying Coney Island facility, Victor Kozlov is finalizing his predatory sequence. He maps out the elementary school, using spent ammunition to anchor the schematic. His vocal effect is flat as he details a 60-second abduction protocol. When warned about the presence of armed security, Victor processes the data without a spike in his heart rate, computing the mathematical probability of a successful strike. It is a dark reminder. While we are busy making beautiful emotional promises about tomorrow, pure malice is meticulously plotting its move for today. Victor relies on statistical dominance, deploying 8 operatives against a 2-man security detail. His facial scar contorts into a chilling display of sadistic anticipation. He states his intention to inflict maximum psychological devastation upon Nicholas. Fast forward to the precise operational hour. 3 o'clock in the courtyard, Emily holds tightly to Sophia, while Tommy bravely attempts to manage his sensory overload to simulate a normal familial routine. It is a heartbreaking display of emotional resilience. Behind them, the bodyguard leans casually against a fixture, entirely failing to recognize the environmental pre-attack indicators. The ultimate tragedy is this. The greatest threats rarely announce themselves with a warning. They slip in quietly while we are desperately pretending we are perfectly safe. Let us open this file, examining it as a study of human panic and predator behavior. You and I have reviewed countless cases, yet the velocity of this violence is striking. At 3:05, a white van breaches the perimeter before the tires even halt. 4 assailants pour out, exhibiting classic pack-hunting dynamics. The bodyguard, David, reacts on reflex, neutralizing the lead attacker with a single shot. However, the psychological shockwave paralyzes the rest. Another operative violently hoists the child, Sophia, off the pavement. Johnny engages in a brutal struggle, cracking a heavy right hook into an attacker's skull. In seconds, a mundane afternoon fractures into severe trauma. The lesson here is simple: routine is just a fragile illusion we use to feel safe. Observe the raw mechanics of dominance at play. The second assailant, possessing the physical mass of a heavy bruiser, brings a steel baton crashing down on Johnny's skull. The neurological shutoff is instantaneous. Emily attempts to shield the autistic boy, Tommy, but is subjected to a severe physical subjugation, a violent yank by her hair that completely destabilizes her. In the midst of this terror, she screams for David to alert Nicholas. 45 seconds. That is the exact duration of this psychological rupture. The victims are shoved into the van, vanishing toward Ocean Parkway. David is left bleeding heavily against a light pole, his leg severely lacerated. It reminds us of a harsh reality. Survival rarely favors the righteous, it favors the prepared. Trauma suppresses pain. David barely registers the bullet tearing through his flesh, his adrenaline masking the severe tissue damage. With shaking hands, he forces himself to dial his employer, reporting the abduction and the van heading toward the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway. We then pivot to Nicholas at the Moretti Tower. He is projecting the polished facade of a syndicate leader, yet, within 3 seconds of hearing the news, his psychological armor shatters. He stands with such violent force, his chair impacts the glass. He immediately recognizes the signature of his rival Koslov. Meanwhile, Emily is forced onto the freezing metal floor of the van, blinded by a hood, forced to listen to the terrified cries of the children. The mind under extreme duress is entirely unique. Tommy begins counting loudly, a self-soothing mechanism triggered by profound overload. When a captor barks an order to silence him, Emily demonstrates extraordinary emotional regulation. Despite the sensory deprivation of her hood, she calmly warns that gagging the boy will induce a catastrophic panic attack, leading to severe self-injury against the floor. Surprisingly, the kidnapper processes this variable and permits the counting. After a 40-minute transit, they arrive at a freezing, damp concrete cell. As the hoods are removed, Sophia immediately seeks physical refuge in Emily's clothing. It proves that true strength often lies in remaining perfectly calm when everything falls apart. Tommy isolates himself in the corner, facing the blank wall to minimize visual stimuli, his counting escalating. Enter Victor Koslov. You and I must look closely at this man. He is the textbook definition of a megalomaniac narcissist. He sports platinum hair and an unsettling, hollow smile. He actively mocks Emily, deriving sadistic pleasure from the severe power imbalance. He demands Nicholas arrive unarmed, assuming complete psychological dominance. Victor casually sits down, threatening to surgically dismember Sophia if his terms are not met. The sheer clinical detachment in his voice causes Tommy to pause his counting for one agonizing second before resuming louder. It is a chilling reminder of how easily innocence is crushed by adult pathology. Deep within a subterranean parking structure, Nicholas acts against every ingrained instinct of his antisocial personality profile. He contacts the federal authorities. Agent Chen answers after 2 rings, in a rare display of vulnerability. Nicholas completely dismantles his own ego, offering Victor Koslov and the Red Hook terminal network in exchange for tactical intervention. He exposes years of systemic corruption, the shipping manifests, the shell corporations, the illicit wire transfers. He is systematically executing his own criminal empire to ensure the survival of his daughter. We can clinically dissect his morality all day, but the core lesson remains undeniable. The deepest human bonds will always override basic self-preservation when pushed to the limit. Agent Robert Chen maintains absolute stillness in his vehicle, subjecting Nicholas to 10 excruciating seconds of silence, a classic tactic to establish behavioral control. Chen finally agrees, imposing a non-negotiable parameter. The federal agents lead the breach, and Nicholas must remain entirely passive on the perimeter. Nicholas accepts this profound loss of autonomy with a single word. The suppressed hostility radiating from him is palpable. We advance to 7:45 p.m. Tactical units are silently staging beneath the elevated transit lines of Brighton Beach. Nicholas and 8 of his enforcers conceal themselves near a dilapidated structure. Entirely obscured from the target zone, they are coiled springs, waiting for the violent release of tension. Nicholas initiates contact, utilizing the number Victor forced his daughter to memorize. He verbally commits to entering the northern access point alone in exactly 10 minutes. Upon terminating the call, he reveals a strategy that borders on suicidal ideation. His associate Marco will breach the eastern perimeter simultaneously with the federal assault. Marco correctly identifies the mortality risk, but Nicholas rigidly enforces his command. He approaches the facility projecting complete submission, hands raised in a calculated display of vulnerability. However, concealed near his ankle is a 4-inch blade. 2 perimeter guards conduct a flawed physical search, missing the weapon entirely. He is shoved into the vast concrete loading zone. The trap is active. Let us observe the spatial dynamics of the room together. Victor positions himself centrally, insulated by 6 armed subordinates. Feeding his grandiosity, Emily and the children are restrained against a structural steel column. The child screams for her father, Nicholas. Attempting to regulate his own severe internal panic, inquires about their physical status. Victor responds with a dry, contemptuous laugh, forcing Nicholas into a physical posture of submission on his knees. A firearm is pressed directly to his skull. In a fascinating display of stress control, Nicholas does not flinch. Instead, he introduces a highly disruptive variable, detailing the exposed shipping manifests and offshore accounts. He is weaponizing information to manipulate the timeline. Nicholas coldly delivers the critical psychological blow. Federal Agent Chen is currently reviewing those exact files. Victor experiences a momentary cognitive freeze, his motor functions stalling as he processes the threat. In that precise microsecond of hesitation, the main barriers are violently breached. Tactical operatives flood the space with overwhelming auditory and visual chaos. A massive exchange of gunfire erupts as Marco breaches the eastern flank. Nicholas exploits the distraction instantly. Deflecting the weapon as the first projectile impacts the concrete, he launches himself toward his family. But an opposing rifle round tears through his upper shoulder mass. Adrenaline overrides his pain receptors. He reaches his targets and deploys the hidden blade. With calculated precision, Nicholas severs the synthetic restraints holding Emily and Sophia. Tommy, locked in his coping mechanism, has reached the number 113. Nicholas issues a firm directive for Emily to evacuate the miners through the secured eastern exit. She complies, guiding them into the dense smoke suspended in the air. But observe Nicholas's behavioral pivot. He does not flee. He turns his focus back to the primary aggressor. Victor is utilizing cover behind wooden cargo crates. Nicholas coldly secures a discarded law enforcement rifle. He discharges 3 precise rounds through the barrier, inflicting massive trauma to Victor's body. Tactical units rapidly secure the threat. It is a harsh, clinical end to an absolute nightmare. We transition to the exterior, illuminated by the rhythmic pulses of emergency vehicles. Emily is seated on the pavement, exhibiting acute emotional release, crying silently. Tommy ceases his counting the moment his neurosensory system registers the safety of the open air. Marco confirms their security just as Nicholas emerges from the structure. He is suffering significant blood loss, his shoulder thoroughly compromised. Here we observe a profound psychological phenomenon, a complex bond akin to Stockholm Syndrome. Emily bypasses rational self-preservation, rushing to embrace this highly dangerous, violent individual. He accepts the embrace despite his severe physical trauma. It highlights how shared survival often creates the most unbreakable psychological tethers. He verbally confirms his intense fear of separation, and she mirrors the sentiment. Agent Chen interrupts this emotional regulation, maintaining his rigid bureaucratic persona, demanding the promised documentation by 6 a.m. Nicholas offers silent compliance. Victor is transported past them, medically stabilized but destined for permanent isolation, in a high-security federal facility in Marion, Illinois. 48 hours later, the environment shifts to a sterile medical suite. Nicholas is restricted to bed rest. The projectile fortunately missed critical vascular structures, but the physical toll is massive. You see, even when we survive our darkest traumas, the body always keeps the score. Every violent action carries a debt that must eventually be paid in full. Let us open this clinical file together and examine the baseline. Nicholas sits with 14 fresh stitches. Given a mandatory rest period, his controlling psychology will absolutely compel him to ignore. Emily anchors herself nearby, holding the sleeping Sophia. Young Tommy engages in a classic trauma-soothing mechanism, building a perfectly symmetrical barrier out of colored blocks. Marco slips in to report that Vanessa was intercepted at the Miami airport. Nicholas coldly delegates her fate to the authorities, a massive shift from his former enforcer mentality. Marco exits, and Emily listens to the heavy click of the door. The human mind is resilient, but remember this simple lesson. You might walk out of a burning building, but the scent of smoke stays with you forever. The pathology of relief is fascinating. Nicholas claims he feels lighter, finally processing the delayed justice for his late wife, predictably. He soon rejects medical observation and retreats to his Brooklyn territory. Inside, Tommy is covered in flour, intensely focused on rolling pasta. It is a grounding technique, and witnessing it deeply moves Emily. The environment mimics absolute safety. when the doorbell chimes. Nicholas checks the monitors and perceives a harmless delivery worker. Emily approaches the door, fully submerged in the illusion of a quiet domestic existence. But perceived safety is often a blind spot in our threat response. We tend to drop our guard exactly when we should brace for impact, leaving us painfully exposed to the darkness waiting on the porch. Let us analyze Frank Delaney. Weeks of isolation have triggered a severe narcissistic collapse. Visibly emaciated and consumed by cognitive distortion, he cannot process his own failures. Instead, his mind projects the blame entirely onto Emily. He conceals an 8-inch blade. When he lunges, observe Emily's neurological reaction. She does not fight or flee, she freezes. Her nervous system regresses to her previous domestic abuse, instantly paralyzing her motor functions. She is trapped in a profound trauma loop, unable to move a muscle. It serves as a stark reminder of our deepest vulnerabilities. The most dangerous threats we face are rarely the armed strangers standing in front of us, but rather the unresolved psychological patterns echoing from our past. Nicholas completely bypasses his own survival instincts. He sprints across the room, disregarding his physical limitations, and physically displaces Emily from the threat. The blade sinks deeply into his abdomen. From the kitchen, Sophia screams, cementing this fresh trauma into her young developing brain. Frank attempts a secondary strike, but Marco neutralizes the attacker with overwhelming blunt force, instantly incapacitating him against the drywall. The clinical irony in this sequence is absolutely staggering. A calculated man who survived decades of organized assassination attempts is critically wounded by a deeply unstable amateur. The lesson is inescapable. The very moment we allow ourselves to truly care for another human being, we voluntarily surrender our strongest defensive armor. The scene rapidly descends into chaos. Nicholas applies pressure to his severe abdominal wound, yet his protector complex overrides the agony as he reassures Emily of her safety now. Observe the children's acute trauma responses. Sophia exhibits silent crying, muting her distress, which is a dangerous internalizing behavior that forms deep psychological scars. Tommy enters in a state of sheer dissociation. He moves lethargically, his young brain completely unable to process the severe violence, while his hand still tightly clutches a small plastic toy. This forces us to acknowledge a difficult reality. Psychological stability is profoundly fragile. It takes months to build a secure mental sanctuary for a damaged family, but only a few chaotic seconds to burn it straight back to the ground. Look closely at this interaction with me. Tommy approaches the trauma zone and places his plastic block into Nicholas's hand. This is pure object transference. The child gives a totem of personal safety to anchor the wounded man to reality. Nicholas offers a final reassurance before his body begins failing. During transport, Emily desperately tries to maintain a verbal tether, but Nicholas succumbs to hemorrhagic shock and loses consciousness. The sterile efficiency of the trauma ward takes over. It leaves us with a sobering psychological observation. A person can completely restructure their behavioral patterns and finally make the right choices, yet still find themselves entirely at the mercy of chaotic, unavoidable fate. The physical damage is critical. The weapon lacerated the liver, causing severe hemorrhaging, while the surgeons operate. Emily waits under the sterile lights, holding an exhausted Sophia. Now, observe the immediate behavioral shift in the environment. The old defense mechanisms of the syndicate instantly reactivate. Marco establishes a physical blockade at the doors, while loyalists lock down every access point of the hospital. Nicholas tried to systematically dismantle his violent lifestyle, but this attack forced an immediate regression to maximum defensive posturing, trapping his family behind heavy barricades once again. It demonstrates a fundamental law of survival. True peace cannot merely be requested or passively desired. It must be actively and aggressively defended. Salambardi arrives, projecting the fatigue of a man conditioned by decades of violence, sitting opposite Emily. He provides crucial insight into Nicholas's psychological evolution, having observed him since adolescence. He notes that Nicholas's youthful delusion of invincibility has vanished entirely. In his earlier years, Nicholas displayed the classic grandiosity of an untouchable operative. He thought he was completely bulletproof. Today, his deep emotional attachment to Emily has introduced genuine, debilitating fear into his previously cold psyche. He finally has something monumental to lose. This highlights a fascinating behavioral paradox. The absolute greatest vulnerability for a highly dominant, controlling personality is finally finding another human being they simply cannot survive losing. Salambardi frames Nicholas's capacity for secondary attachment as genuine psychological bravery. This observation shatters Emily's emotional suppression, triggering a massive release of tears. By midnight, the syndicate fully activates its infrastructure. Operatives safely transport the sleeping children to secure locations, functioning as a highly protective surrogate family network. Deep into the quiet night, the heavy surgical barrier finally opens. The lead physician emerges, lowering his sterile mask to address the room. It illustrates exactly how severe medical trauma strips away all worldly status, regardless of your accumulated wealth, street intimidation, or vast territorial dominance. There are terrifying moments when your entire existence depends solely on the next word spoken by a complete stranger. Emily experiences a sudden loss of motor control as the physician delivers the clinical outcome. The procedure was highly successful. The internal damage repaired, and the patient is fully stabilized instantly. Emily's parasympathetic nervous system activates. She collapses, openly weeping to purge the massive accumulation of acute traumatic stress. Hours later, inside the sterile quiet of the intensive care unit, medical monitors track a perfectly stable cardiac rhythm. Nicholas slowly transitions out of the heavy chemical anesthesia, fighting his way through the dense cognitive fog. His voice is incredibly weak, but he manages a quiet, simple greeting. It highlights a beautiful biological truth. The greatest psychological reward any human can ever experience is the immediate confirmation that their deepest emotional attachments have survived the darkness. Let us analyze this exchange together. The psychological resolution is textbook. Emily initiates with a gentle reprimand, drawing out a pained laugh. She then supplies the data needed to lower his defenses, confirming the children are safe and the attacker is permanently incarcerated. Nicholas then verbalizes a massive cognitive shift. He admits that during his active dying process, his mind did not default to the grief of his past. His final conscious thought was focused entirely on Emily's survival. That was his ultimate metric for peace. Emily reciprocates the affection, demanding a firm promise of future stability, as dawn breaks over the city. The acute trauma cycle finally dissipates. It reminds us that profound behavioral breakthroughs rarely occur in comfort. You often must survive absolute psychological darkness to truly appreciate the healing light of a brand new morning. Observe the behavioral stabilization over the next 3 weeks. Nicholas rehabilitates in his secure residence. Emily maintains daily visits with the children, her professional peers ignorant of her severe trauma survival, organically. These 4 fractured individuals construct a stable, healthy familial dynamic. The most significant neurological restructuring occurs within Tommy. Having developed in an environment of chronic domestic hostility, his psychological threat receptors were constantly elevated. Now, exposed to a quiet home, with Nicholas providing a calm, non-aggressive male baseline, Tommy's defensive barriers completely dissolve. He actively communicates and cheerfully shares his thoughts. It yields a stunning clinical observation. The human brain possesses a remarkable capacity to naturally rewire itself for joy, the absolute second it realizes it is finally, unconditionally safe from harm. Today you and I are going to examine the behavioral pivot in our primary subject, Nicholas. Before his final strategic move, observe the microdynamics. The boy Tommy assigns him an identity devoid of fear, calling him Uncle Starfish due to a palmar scar. Meanwhile, the juvenile dependent, Sophia, forms a symbiotic bond with Tommy. We observe the adult subjects one Thursday evening. Elevated above the Manhattan grid, Nicholas initiates a massive structural divestment. He is dismantling his organized crime syndicate, transferring authority to subordinates driven by base greed, and retaining only legal corporate structures. The psychological life lesson here is striking. True emotional stability simply neutralizes the addictive dopamine loop of chaotic power, replacing it with authentic human connection. The subject confirms his transition to entirely legitimate operations. Within 18 months, he intends to dissolve his apex predator status. Assuming the role of a civilian contractor and father, he then extracts a small velvet box. He establishes an immediate boundary, clarifying this is not a formal marriage proposal, as both subjects require extensive psychological rehabilitation. Emily examines the contents. It is a modest platinum band, devoid of the grandiose, narcissistic displays typical of cartel leadership. It is a quiet object suited for an educator. She exhibits a profound emotional release, labeling him an anomaly among syndicate bosses. He calmly reclassifies his status to former boss. The lesson is undeniable. Absolute autonomy means possessing the mental fortitude to simply walk away from absolute control. You and I will now unpack the contradiction in their spatial dynamics. After their initial intimacy, Emily actively rejects the submissive role of a syndicate dependent. She occupies an independent unit beneath his, dictating the perimeter and the boundaries. Nicholas, a man accustomed to unilateral domination, suppresses his controlling urges. By autumn, he covertly finances a specialized neurological program for Tommy. Emily exhibits expected resistance, yet she suppresses her pride to ensure her sibling's survival. Sophia continues her daily visits to seek maternal validation. Emily maintains a hidden supply of golden reward markers, strictly reserved for the former kingpin's daughter. The psychological lesson is clear. True partnership requires entirely surrendering control. The clinical observation shifts to a cold October afternoon in a public green space, beneath a vividly colored maple tree. Sophia is engaged in a repetitive motor skill exercise with Tommy, tossing a rubber sphere amidst falling foliage. Emily extends her left hand. The metallic band is already affixed. She calmly verbalizes her psychological readiness. This is the moment of complete emotional collapse. Nicholas, a primary aggressor who historically deployed terror as his main instrument, begins to weep silently. His vocal cords tremor as he summons the juveniles to broadcast the development. Sophia displays a hyperactive emotional response. Tommy, however, demonstrates an acute stress pause. He processes this intimidating figure and innocently inquires if the entity known as Uncle Starfish will finally assume the paternal role. He affirms the child's request with absolute psychological sincerity. Stick with me, as this is where our evaluation yields its most vital conclusion. The central life lesson we extract from this case file is profound. Authentic power operates quietly, and genuine emotional bonding resists artificial acceleration. When an individual enforces strict boundaries yet maintains gentle proximity, that stability restructures an entire familial unit. Watching an apex predator willingly absorb threats to protect a dependent fundamentally alters their shared trajectory. If this clinical dissection of two contrasting profiles proved insightful, please signal your approval. Share this analysis with those who need it. Subscribe to the channel, and document your geographic location in the comment section below. I require you to critically analyze whether these behavioral patterns reflect the psychological conflicts manifesting in your own environment. My team reviews every single written submission, and we genuinely value your diagnostic input. It is a fascinating paradox that the profile of a highly dangerous entity provides the ultimate masterclass in constructing an impregnable emotional sanctuary. That is the definitive cognitive subversion. Therefore, I conclude this session by wishing you all genuine physiological health, absolute mental equilibrium, and a stabilized domestic environment where your threat response is permanently deactivated. Maintain your situational awareness, aggressively protect your emotional dependence, and we shall convene again shortly to deconstruct the next complex behavioral anomaly.
Nicholas Moretti has enormous power. He can buy debts, move people, hire lawyers, place guards, and remove threats. When he learns about Emily's abusive stepfather, he could easily take over her life and make every decision for her. But the story becomes meaningful because Emily does not immediately surrender her independence, and Nicholas learns to respect that. This is one of the strongest educational lessons in the story. Real protection must respect the person being protected. Emily has already lived under control. Frank controlled her money, her home, her fear, and Tommy's safety. Because of that, she is right to be cautious. Even when Nicholas offers help, she asks what it will cost. That question shows wisdom, not ingratitude. Many people who escape abuse are vulnerable to another form of control, disguised as rescue. Someone may say, "I'm helping you," while still taking away choice. Nicholas's growth is shown in the fact that he listens. He does not force Emily to accept everything. He gives her space. He supports her legal fight. He protects her and Tommy, but he also allows Emily to keep her dignity. This matters deeply. Survivors do not only need safety, they need agency. They need the right to say yes, no, not yet, or not like this. Healing cannot grow if a person simply moves from one cage into another. For viewers, the lesson is clear. Helping someone does not mean owning their future. True support gives people more choices, not fewer. It strengthens their voice instead of replacing it. Nicholas's protection becomes meaningful because he does not only stand in front of danger, he also learns to stand beside Emily, letting her remain herself. That is the difference between control and love.